Welcome back to Transcriber from Reddit. Today's topic comes from a podcast. Now, originally, I found out about the podcast through a comments section that unfortunately I no longer remember where it was or what the topic of conversation was. However, because of them, I found out about this Mike Hintz podcast featured on an open letter podcast done back on May 11th of 2017. Now, the reason that I am covering this podcast is because Mike Hintz was a fairly reputable pastor back in early 2000s. Even President Bush was singling out Mike and his wife Charla Hintz as a couple that benefited from his tax plan when he was talking about tax cuts. However, shortly after Mike Hintz was discovered to have an inappropriate sexual relationship with a 17-year-old girl who was a member of the church's youth group. Now, Hintz originally denied the allegations. Then the church decided to fire Hintz on October 30th. He also later admitted and pled guilty to the charge of sexual exploitation by a counselor. Investigators found that although there was not any force involved, there was a lot of emotional and mental uncertainty on the girl's part. This comes from an expose done by the Omaha/Nebraska site. And I will link to this article as well as to the article that talks about the tax cuts in the description below. Now, you might be wondering, why is Mike Hintz on a podcast called Open Letter? And why is he talking about it? After all, if you read the episode notes, it reads as follows. Over 10 years ago, the Hintz's world imploded. Mike, father of 4 young children and a youth pastor at a large church in Des Moines, Iowa, confessed to a crime that shocked the church, his community, and especially his wife, Charla. Mike had an inappropriate relationship with a girl in his youth group. No one saw this coming. A mistake like this would have been the end of most marriages, certainly an end to any future contributions to ministry. And yet, miraculously, Mike and Charla are still married and doing great, over 10 years later. This is Mike's story. In this interview, Mike is brutally honest about his sin and the long, difficult road to recovery. I don't know if it would be accurate to say that it would be an end to any future contributions to ministry when you see people like the Falwells, like Ravi Zacharias, like, let's say a certain pastor that used to be pastor to the core in Appleton and now is serving as a pastor down in Texas. It's definitely not an end to any contributions in ministry. As to the claim that Mike and Charla are married and doing great over 10 years later, well, I will leave that up to you as we listen through this. I listened through it the first time and I wanted to cover it for an episode because this is what an apology from a spiritual leader does not look like. It does not victim blame the 17-year-old girl he had an inappropriate relationship with. It does not blame his wife, Charla. And yet that is what Mike is about to do in this podcast. You'll see that I went ahead and skipped to 7 minutes and 42 seconds into the podcast because there is some intro music, there's some chit-chat between the hosts as well as Mike, and the part that I'm about to play for you is what the hosts are going to call just a quick get to know you for Mike. So so this will start out with them getting information from Mike about him, his life, and some of the more pertinent details before Mike goes into his story.
So, Mike, to start off, we are going to play a little bit of speed round because we got a lot of information to get to today. So, Carol and I are going to go back and forth and kind of ask you some questions and kind of get some background information about who you are. Because I don't know if you know this, but you're kind of a unique dude.
I am.
You are, and and your wife Charla, who is just a doll. She's wonderful. She has written a book about kind of what's happened for you guys over the last 10 years or so, and I'm reading that now. And boy, she describes you well. I could just picture teenage Mike. It's great.
That is interesting that she wrote a book about them. I am curious to read this book at some point. I want to know more about the Hintz's relationship, as well as glean any insight as to how and why they are still together.
All right, Carol, are you ready to start speed round with Mike? It looks like you got the first few questions here. Fire away.
Where did you go to college?
North Central Bible College and Iowa State.
So do you have a master's degree then?
No, I just, I really loved college. And I went to UNI as well for a little bit in the middle of that.
Me too.
Our former pastor at Grand Rapids First, Scott Hagan, has just been appointed the new president of North Central.
Did not know that.
Get out of town. I didn't know that.
Did.
How about that?
I guess you are out of town, so that makes sense.
Kind of funny, but not pertinent to the main topic.
There you go. We're obedient.
This is
Nothing
not much
else.
of a speed round, is it?
No, go ahead. We're
Okay.
good.
What was your major?
I majored in pastoral studies, biblical studies, and with a minor in Greek, philosophy, and youth ministry.
What kind of career were you hoping for?
I was hoping to become a youth pastor or a youth speaker of some type.
Run down the jobs that you had.
Like,
When you're
Like
in
just
college.
make a list. Make a list of all the jobs you've had.
Now, I do want to point out that many pastors have a vision of what kind of ministry they want to lead. So the fact that he wants to lead a youth ministry is not, I'm going to say, it's not incriminating. Every pastor has an idea of what kind of mission field they want to be in. And Mike is no different in that regard.
well, okay, I did Tasseled Corn. I was a host at Red Lobster. I was a windsurfing and sailing instructor. I helped run a marina. I was a cab driver. I was a youth pastor. I flipped houses. I started a couple companies, and now I'm a campus pastor, and I'm the campus of an multi-state pastor.
That's awesome. I think you just actually taught David a few new things.
I did not know. You're living in Iowa. What are you doing at a marina or windsurfing? I'm like, what? I don't know. I don't know if you understand how that works. Anyway.
I know. Well, it was a small note, but I did sell sailboats there, and I taught windsurfing and sailing lessons. It was awesome. Best job.
I believe it. That fits your personality. When you
Interesting, but again, not pertinent to the topic at hand. I do understand why the hosts are doing this, to get Mike comfortable leading up to the fact that they're about to have this hard discussion. But keep in mind that this is all leading up to the discussion. This is all getting Mike comfortable to lead up to, why did you have an affair against your wife and committed a crime by having a sexually inappropriate relationship with a 17-year-old girl? Now, I did switch two words there, from inappropriate sexual relationship to sexually inappropriate relationship. I don't see much of a difference between the two. If you're going to have, there's an inappropriate emotional attachment that an older man can have with a 17-year-old girl, and then it transcends from emotional to sexual attachment to the 17-year-old girl. Either way, she's still technically a minor. And he was her youth pastor. Now, I do want to clarify this point. Everybody knows what it was like being a teenager, or at least I hope that you remember what it was like being a teenager. All those hormones, all that uncertainty, and either you were really apathetic, you could have had extreme attractions or detractions towards people. There's a lot of things that are going on. But as a teenager, most people would agree that but with the exception for certain things, obviously, like murder's one of them. And if you were sexually assaulting a kid, that would be another one. But for most general teenager style activities, people are going to look at you and say, you were a teenager and you deserve a second chance. Or you were a teenager and you were under the influence of someone with power. In this case, Mike Hintz, as a youth pastor, has that power over that teenage girl.
A cab driver, and again, from Charlotte's book, did you really take a guy's stereo as payment?
Yes, I did.
You followed up into his apartment and got a stereo.
Yep, I did. Because he took my cab and he didn't have money to pay me. So I said, you can have your stereo back when you bring me the amount of money that was due, which was like $17 or something like that. And I told him exactly where to find me, and he never came back.
That is pretty ballsy, and honestly, I can't fault Pastor Mike for that. Now, was he a pastor when he did that? I don't know. But at the same time, everyone deserves to be paid for the work that they do. And as a cab driver, if you are not getting paid what you are owed, there are very few ways for you to make that money back. So, again, I don't fault Pastor Mike Hintz for this.
Do you still have the stereo?
No.
Wow.
I don't even think I kept it. I was just mad that he tried to rob me of a fare.
Another cab question is, did guys really chase your cab and jump on it and you kept driving?
Oh, yeah, because they would have killed me otherwise. I stopped to pick up this guy,
Yeah.
and he said, hold on just a second. He was walking with some guys, and all of a sudden he started running to my car, and he jumped in, and he was like, go, go, go. And there was a mob of like 4 or 5 guys chasing him, and I had a split-second decision to either allow them to mob the car or peel out and get out of there. So I chose peel out. They all jumped on my car, and they were yelling at me like, we know what you look like, cabbie. We're going to kill you if we find you, kind of thing.
Oh, my.
So I drove about a half mile down the road, and then I turned around, and after I took the guy's money, not all of it, just the fare, I kicked him out of my cab and told him, don't you ever sell drugs, and then jumped in my car again.
Maybe if you would have offered the 4 gentlemen chasing you that stereo, you could have come to some type of agreement.
I know, that's what, I should have kept it with me, but I didn't.
You really should have. It would have been a great thing to.
Where was he cab driving? This doesn't sound like something that would happen in Iowa, but that's another reason for me to read Charlotte Hintz's book, I guess.
Harder with. Where was your first pastoral job?
It was in Cedar Falls, Iowa. That was the first job after I graduated college. I did have an internship before that, but Cedar Falls, I was a youth pastor, small little youth group there at a church called Glad Tidings.
So Carol's somewhat familiar with that.
I lived in Cedar Falls for 7 years.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it was actually close to I think the water tower was nearby there.
Yeah.
I can't remember the road.
All right.
It is kind of sad that you have to locate things by a water tower. But
That's Cedar Falls for you.
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
But that was before I associated with people. Like,
Did you go to a different place after that?
I did. I was there for about 2 years. I was a part-time youth pastor. The youth group grew, and I got a call from a church in Omaha called Trinity Church, and they hired me to be their youth pastor, and that was where I went next.
Awesome. And then eventually I know you came back to Des Moines. What year did you come back to Des Moines?
It was 2001, August.
Yep. And what was it about First Assembly that brought you there?
Well, it was the church I grew up in. It was my home church. And my parents and my wife's parents, they all lived in Des Moines. And we had 4 little kids. And so we needed help.
Yeah.
Okay, so by this time, they have 4 little kids. Now, I don't their ages aren't given here, which I appreciate because children too often can be brought into the affairs of adults when they aren't supposed to be. I do wonder, when he started out at Cedar Falls and then went to Omaha before ultimately coming to Des Moines, when he had that inappropriate sexual relationship with a 17-year-old, what was the spacing like for his kids? Was there opportunity, were there resources for his wife to raise these kids while he's out doing pastoring? Because pastoring is a lot of heavy emotional and mental labor. Not only are you doing a lot of work and get paid very little, but you are called out at often almost all hours doing a variety of jobs, from praying with people who are elderly to praying with people who are in a hospital to meeting with board members, meeting with church members. It's a lot of work. And I don't want people to think that I don't understand what pastors go through, because pastors go through a lot without necessary support. But at the same time, that also includes pastors' wives. It's very hard for pastors' wives to be accepted by the congregation, even if their husband is accepted, because a small town congregation can often be very catty and very isolating for a new pastor's wife, especially one that is having kids, which makes it more difficult for her to have help and have the resources that she needs to be able to raise them. And that's not even getting into whether or not pastors' wives work, because sometimes pastors' wives have to work outside the congregation just to make ends meet. And with 4 young kids, I can see it really being as much of a need for Charla and Mike and their household and expenses as it was a, quote, calling, end quote. Again, I don't want to assign a negative impression here, but that is really how I see it. When a church has a pastor and a pastor's wife, and they've been in the ministry and they have young children, the easiest way for the church to take care of them often is just calling, or which is a fancy word for God, in quotes. Usually a decision made by all men is reassigning this pastor and his young wife to a different congregation. Again, that's God in quotes, because it's a bunch of men usually praying and trying to decide whether or not to call someone back, and then making that decision on, well, do we like the guy? Do we think we like the guy? Do we know the guy? Does anybody have any past history with this guy? It's very much a human decision. I'm not saying it can't be influenced by God, but on the face of it, it is very much humans making the decision and masking it as a calling by God. I don't necessarily blame them for making the decision that they made, because Mike and Charla and their 4 young kids especially need some assistance desperately. But you see how quickly it can be or how quickly someone can see the fine line where it's God's calling one moment, but then people are making the decision based off of, well, their family is here, so therefore we need to call them back, kind of deal. So then it's less of a calling by God versus calling by humans made, and they're asking for God's blessing with that call.
And they
How old were the kids?
In 2001, Emery was 1 year old, Drake was 3, Josiah was 4, and McKenna was 5.
Whew. Yeah, I remember that. Do you ever regret moving back to Des Moines and going back to First Assembly? And
I do apologize. I completely didn't remember this part of the episode where he mentions their names and ages at this point in time. I don't remember if he says anything about them in the future, but just mentioning the ages would have been good enough. But as you can tell, they were very young children.
of the story we're about to tell here in a couple of minutes.
Well, of course, like, I would love to say I lived my whole life without regret, but there have been times where I regretted it, but I've come to the place where I just accept it, and now it's just part of my story. So I don't feel regret that I came back to Iowa any. I think it was actually part of the plan.
That's interesting that he is admitting to mixed feelings, and he won't come out and directly say that he regretted anything or what he regretted about coming back to Iowa. Now, this is where his family was. This is where his home church was. Why would there be any sense of regret, unless the regret just comes from him conducting an inappropriate sexual relationship with a 17-year-old girl? But maybe there were other regrets, and maybe those fed into that sexual misconduct.
That sounds too deterministic. I think I used my decision, and it was good.
Right. You and I met. We met in the summer of 2001, and I
Yes.
had already been the children's pastor because I had gotten there in January at First Assembly in Des Moines, Iowa. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I had been a warehouse employee for 11 years, and you got there, and you had been a pastor for a while, and I remember you and I obviously kind of hit it off and became friends. And
Yes.
and as I was saying earlier, you walked me through after I resigned because of my addiction to pornography. In fact,
That's interesting that the host openly admits to his addiction to pornography, and that's why he resigned.
Mark Gamble were the only two guys who even knew what was going on.
Yep.
And you played a large part in me coming forward and confessing because I was good about not getting caught. I could hide it well. And do you remember confronting me on a September Friday afternoon and telling me that God...
All of this is interesting. It doesn't play directly into Mike's crime. But I do find it interesting that Mike Hintz, as a pastor against pornography, led this former pastor to confess and later resign.
Had a word for me. Do you remember that?
I remember it, but probably not as specifically as you do.
Yeah, I remember it really, really specifically.
Yeah.
You volunteered or were assigned to be the pastor to walk me through the year-long restoration process.
Yeah.
We would meet once a month or so.
Yep.
And then we'd have lunch, and you'd kind of just go through the questions that you had to ask, and then, but more than that, you just were my friend, and and loved me, and helped me get back on my feet, which was awesome.
That is.
I thank you for.
And I think that was.
Keep in mind that this relationship doesn't get disclosed in the episode until roughly 15 minutes in to the podcast. So now we have to ask ourselves, why was this relationship not disclosed in the episode notes? And what bearing does it have on Mike's confession that we will hear later in the podcast? Because this has now gone beyond just podcast host and podcast guest. And the host is trying to make the guest feel comfortable before the series of uncomfortable questions. Now it's friend is asking friend to kind of sort of bear all of his sins after admitting one of his sins. And we will see whether or not that friendly relationship between the two of them will affect how Mike Hintz approaches his confession. and his brutal honesty, as was said in the episode notes.
It was a good time for both of us. I mean, it was a hard time, but
Yeah.
it was a good time for our friendship.
It was, and I think that's where it really, because we were coworkers and got along real well. But we were working and whatever. But that's really what solidified our friendship. Absolutely.
I would agree.
And then you got to meet Carol a couple years ago, and you guys
Yes.
got to fall in love with her.
I know, and that was really easy because she's extremely lovable.
I agree very much so.
Yeah, and she's super good at questions.
She is.
She takes a situation that's like, hey, we're having a good conversation. I wonder how we can go deeper, Carol. Boom, we're deeper. That's how it works.
Yeah, it's a superpower.
It is.
So, to not go too much deeper right now, going a little lighter.
Oh, yeah, see, there you go. It was like a setup.
We're going a little lighter here. Tell us a little bit about. We want to find out who you really are, and so tell us a little bit about your childhood, like your family dynamics, family situation, where you grew up, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I was born in Muscatine, Iowa. I don't remember much of that. We moved to the Des Moines area when I was 4. I had 3 siblings, an older brother and an older sister, and a younger sister.
Okay.
And the older 2 were 4 and 5 years apart. My brother was 4 years older, and then my younger sister was a year and a half younger than me. We grew up in the middle of the heartland in Des Moines, Iowa. Loved Des Moines even at that time. And it was a good childhood.
Did you have animals?
We did. Thanks for asking.
David is laughing at me.
My favorite dog that I remember from my childhood was a dog named Muggsy, which was
Named
a
what?
Boston Terrier.
Muggsy.
Mugsy.
Yeah,
Okay.
like Muggsy Malone, except it was just a dog. Yeah, I thought it was the ugliest dog on the planet. And it snorted, farted. It was like it would greet people at the door, and it was like a gremlin, and people would freak out because its eyes bugged out.
All funny, all anecdotal, but let's see if Charla's questioning, as Mike put it, her tendency to ask hard questions. Let's see if it comes out after all of these fun anecdotes.
A little bit, and yeah.
Kind of like the dog you love to hate.
Yeah, it was weird. It was, you almost felt sorry for it, but you're also often freaked out.
Oh, nice. It's a good combo.
Yeah, exactly. You didn't get too close.
No. I know there was a situation, and of course I know this is important to the story of who you are, and that was something that was taking place during your childhood. There was some abuse going on there.
Yeah.
Now this, when I first heard it, really shocked me, because the fact that the podcast host, now known to be a friend of Mike's, knew about this childhood abuse that was going on, and Mike is admitting that yes, he suffered some abuse in childhood. Now we do know that from the research, people who are abused in childhood tend to grow up and become abusers themselves. Not excusing behavior, but that would definitely explain partly why Mike went ahead and did what he did. But I do wonder, does Mike ever name the person who abused him?
So in 4th grade, I was sexually abused over not every day, daily, but over a course of about a year. Yeah, that was a difficult time for me as a 4th grader.
Yeah, and you can't. It just messes so much stuff up in your mind and in your personality, your emotions and spirituality and all of that. And and I know that we've talked about, you and I have gone through that. You've shared what's happened to me, and I do think it's a really important point that there was at one time there was an authority figure that kind of interrupted what was happening. And give us a little bit of detail as to what happened there.
Sure. So for me, when this guy, I mean, the perpetrator was much older than I was. And when this happened to me, there was a point where the authority figure came in, and I thought, hallelujah, I'll be rescued. And instead, I was condemned. Like, I can't believe what's going on. I never want to see this kind of.
Now that is extremely tragic and heartbreaking that he was getting sexually abused. Perpetrator was not named, just described as significantly older, and an authority figure comes in and immediately degrades him, the victim, as being the problem. No one should have to go through that. And in this case, it is in my less than humble opinion that the one who perpetrated this against Mike be named and shamed. Although the alternative does exist that Mike made this up.
Behavior again, that kind of action, and you can't tell anybody about it. And so for me, that, I think the best statement I can think of is children are really, really good receptors, but they're horrible interpreters.
Yeah.
So as I was receiving this, like I took it all in. My interpretation was, I've done something so bad that if the people, even the closest people to me, knew about it, they wouldn't accept me. And so I can't tell anyone.
But that was exactly what the perpetrator wanted you to think, Mike. Did you notice how Mike even victim blames himself here? Children are good receivers, but I don't know the exact word that he used, but you received it exactly how the authority figure that interceded on behalf of the perpetrator wanted you to take it. Don't tell anyone, you're the problem, and it is your fault. That is you being victim blamed and being threatened to stay silent because otherwise no one will believe you. That's not on you, and that's not on anyone who is on the receiving end of this threat. If you are on the receiving end of a threat like this, that is because they know they're doing wrong and they are afraid of you saying anything. So their only defense is to make you more terrified to tell people so that their secrets don't get let out. In this case, prison terms for both of them, hopefully in the Gen Pop population. He was in 4th grade, come on.
Yep.
So what were some of the lessons, not good lessons, but what were some of the realities? How did that shape your reality in the way that you're like, here's some of the lessons and things I'm taking away from that even after that ended?
Sure. Obviously, I had this catastrophic event that happened in my life, and I felt like I couldn't share it with anybody. So, anything that I felt was negative had to be hidden. I was a very striving individual, so I strived really hard for everything that I did. I grew up in the Assemblies of God. I'm not sure, but I think it's the most striving, performance-based religion out there.
Wow.
I remember when I was a kid feeling like I lost my salvation every time I sinned, so I had to.
To be fair, that's not just in Assemblies of God. I would say that I felt it growing up in the Wells. And I would also say that some of the friends that I have that are Roman Catholics, they have admitted feeling that once or twice. There is a different level of performance that is demanded for each denomination that you belong in. And I would just say, for what it's worth, that it shouldn't, I don't doubt that what he said, or let me rephrase it, I don't doubt that Assemblies of God is very works-oriented, but if the Assemblies of God is works-oriented, then Catholicism is very much heavy traditionalism and very much oriented in praying to Mary, praying to the saints. You need to follow these steps in religion. And the Wells is very much oriented in, yeah, you're forgiven, but we know everything bad you've done. We'll hold it over your head and we'll never let you forget about it. And we'll browbeat you and shame you and guilt you into what you need to do.
Up and pray that Jesus would forgive me so I didn't die or the rapture came while I was still sinning.
Right.
So, that kind of context was in my mind.
That's
Once again, great receptors, horrible interpreters. But when you're growing up and you're...
Great receptors, horrible interpreters. That's not on you, Mike. That is on people around you, the adults around you, who are horrible at translating things or making you feel better. Or in the case of the adult figure, protecting your perpetrator, knowing exactly how to terrify you.
Childhood, and every other year they say Jesus is coming back, so stop sinning in every way, shape, and form. Those are the realities that you interpret into your life. So with that kind of mindset, performance was really a big deal to me, and affirmation was a big deal for me. So I think if I would have to say what lessons I learned from that I applied, it was there was a public persona that I could share with everyone. There was a private persona that I could talk to my friends about, but there was a super private, secret persona that I couldn't share with anybody.
And didn't you say, too, that you really saw yourself as now you're damaged goods?
Oh, yeah. I definitely felt like...
All of which are extremely normal reactions to this. So then we have to ask ourselves, what changed in Mike's life? What changed so that he saw him sexually exploiting a 17-year-old girl in his youth group, and he saw that as okay? All of the things that he described about having public and then semi-private and then a deep, dark persona that no one else knows about, that is very normal in these religions. That's very normal, not just for Assemblies of God, but also for the Wells, Roman Catholicism, Baptists, etc. Especially the more that we're finding out about abusive spiritual leaders.
That's where that striving nature comes in. I always wanted to be better, but I never felt like I was good enough.
Sure, because you couldn't outrun what happened to you.
Right. And I was also told that I wasn't good, that something that I did or happened to me defined my ability to even be good.
Yeah.
So,
I can relate to that more than I care to.
I know it's a sucky place to live, and it's such a hole.
How did that influence your perception of God? Were you aware of a change in your perception of who God was, or was it more subtle than that?
I think this is a good question for her to ask. Again, we just got done, for the most part, listening to Mike admit that he was sexually abused in the 4th grade and that there was an authority figure that shamed him for being sexually abused. And I don't think this question gets asked enough about how people's perception of God changes. Not just if they suffer through traumatic abuse or experiences like Mike did, but even for other things. Does your experience or your perception of God change? Personally, like I said, I think this is a really good question because I don't think we understand enough or really take time to understand our experiences enough to see how God or our perceptions of Him change.
It was probably more subtle just because of my age being like 10 years old when this happened.
Sure.
That, I think anytime you correlate a big event like that happening, you kind of think about how God sees you. I probably would say easily translated into a very striving, religious, try to do good, try to be better, work harder at being better. very low grace internally for myself, a lot of grace for everybody else. But I would beat myself up. I would, I had a lot of negative self-talk that came in, and it probably gave me a reason to feel like God loved me, but he didn't need me. And if I didn't do the right thing, he would just cut me off.
Yeah, and without much of a...
Probably like a fear of that.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, you survived that, and now all of a sudden there's these ingrained messages in your head that you're carrying with you, but that's your normal, of course.
Yeah.
And you don't know life any differently than that.
No, I figure it's everybody's normal.
Really?
That's what I thought at the time. I thought,
right.
well, everybody probably thinks like this.
Right.
To be fair, that's what I thought when I was going through this. Or not through what Mike was going through, but something similar. It's very easy to look at your own experiences, especially when you're growing up as a child and you don't know any better, and say, well, these are my experiences, so therefore everybody's experiencing it. No, every human is their own individual going through their own unique set of experiences. It's all going to be different. But I don't think that, in general, my personal belief, especially having long since moved from childhood to adulthood, it's a lot easier to understand and empathize, or at least do your best to empathize with other people and their experiences as you mature and grow older and realize that your experience wasn't everybody's. That can also lead to a lot of pain when you realize that other people didn't experience the same things you did, especially if you experience something horribly traumatic like sexual abuse, like Mike did. But that can lead to healing. But you have to let yourself go through that and go back through your childhood and think back on, well, why do I think like this? Why am I so focused on X? Why do I feel so hurt and abandoned inside all the time? You have to, as an adult, you have to better equip yourself to do those kinds of conversations so that you can put forth more good going forward instead of taking up all of your past trauma, bundling up with you, and potentially hurting someone, like Mike did. Except in his case, he went through and hurt someone similar to how he was hurted.
And then you meet this young lady who, if you read Charlotte's book, fell pretty hard for you.
Well, she played a little more hard to get than the book relates. But yeah,
a lot of that was internal.
We fell in love pretty hard.
Yeah.
Where did you guys meet?
What was that? We met when she was in 7th grade, I think, and I was in 9th grade. We met at Bible camp and like a summer kids camp or youth camp.
Who do you think fell first? Are you able? Because in the book, Charlotte makes it sound like she fell pretty hard first. Is that accurate?
Okay. Well, no, totally not accurate. Or at least it's not accurate.
Now this is kind of telling, I do find. He admits pretty much straight up that he has not read her book. Now, do I think that he should have read her book after it was published, just so that he understands what she put out there about them? Like, if I was going to publish a memoir about my life, I would probably distribute copies to my husband and my siblings just so they know, hey, this is what your sister is putting out there. But that's just me. He also sees her as playing more hard to get, but doesn't take into account that she probably felt that she had to play hard to get because he was so obtuse, he didn't know that she liked him. Or she felt that she wouldn't be asked out or be asked out successfully by him if she didn't play hard to get. Remember, when they met, this is probably late 80s, early 90s. They would have been really enmeshed, I think, in my less than humble opinion, in some form of like Christian purity culture that was Assemblies of God approved, and it's very much girls don't ask the guys out. Guys, you have to ask the girls out. So then that leads to a lot of flirting and semi-manipulative behavior, in my less than humble opinion.
In the way that I perceived it. So in 7th grade, she was in 7th grade, I was in 8th grade, I introduced her to my best friend, Rick, and they dated for 5 years.
Wow.
Colossal, stupid first move. After that,
I wonder why, though, she and Rick dated. Was it because he asked her out and she figured, well, to remain on good terms with you, potentially, and to not screw up her chances of ever finding a husband, ever, she might as well say yes. And they did date for 5 years. That's not a small amount of time, especially when you're in 8th grade, early high school years.
that ended when I went to UNI where she was at college, and started hanging out with her and my sister, who was her roommate, and really, really started to develop really strong feelings for her. So I was a cab driver, as we talked about earlier, and I went back up to Minneapolis to drive cab for a week, and I thought, okay, God, I know I had a string of not very good relationships, and so I admitted, God, I don't know anything about dating, and I...
So he says that he has a string of not so good relationships. Does that mean that he was trying to date around this time? Does that mean that he was potentially seeing someone where Charla felt that she had no chance with him, so that's why she dated his best friend? I do wonder, because we hear more about Charla right now than we do about Mike and his choices. And I find that very telling. Even now, Mike, even after admitting that he knows about the stress placed on different personas, isn't quite willing to be honest and upfront about his relationship choices here. And without having read Charla's book, she might have done him a favor by not mentioning all of the relationship screw-ups he was in.
kind of sworn off dating about a year earlier. So I said, I just need to know before I let my emotions go on this one, is this the woman you want me to marry or not? And I spent the whole week praying about it. And I came back to Cedar Falls, and I went over to their apartment and went in and was talking to Charlotte. And I told her, this is literally how it happened. She was washing dishes. And I was like, hey, it's good to see you. She was like, oh, it's good to see you. And she's like, I missed you. And I said, I missed you too. And I did a lot of praying and thinking while I was gone. And she said, oh, really? And I said, yeah. And I know that you're the one that I love and I want to marry you. Just threw it out there. We hadn't dated. We hadn't done anything. And mainly because I had never done that before. I'd always played it cool, wanted to make sure that somebody was way into me before I would admit that I was into them at all.
Another interesting admission. At this point, he's saying that they haven't really dated. But immediately he takes it from 0 to 1,000. They're not even in the relationship phase, and he's like, yeah, I missed you too. And then basically, will you marry me? Just right out there, right out the gate. No kind of dating has been done, and he says, like, yeah, I was very much the person of, I wanted to play it cool and safe and have people admit they were into me before I admitted I was into them. And I wonder if she admitted earlier, and he's not saying it, that she admitted earlier to him that she was into him. And maybe that's why she was single at this point in her life, even though they weren't dating, again, by his admission. They were not dating by his admission. But she wasn't dating at this time. When he throws out the, basically, I think God wants you to marry me.
but I felt like I'm trying to hear from God, and I'm just going to go for it. And she looked up at me because she's 5 foot and I'm 5'11".
Right.
And she looked up at me right in the eye, and she's like, "Huh, well, I like you too." That was it. I like you too. So I think I clearly would have been the first one in that scenario, because like and love were, two things we discussed. And that was 2 weeks later when she told me, and it was awesome.
So in the book, Charlotte.
So I can't really fault her for her response to this, because it sounds very much like she was into you and you just wanted to wait and play it safe until, according to you, God kicked you basically in the balls and forced you to admit that you liked her first. And you're wondering, oh, well, I wonder why she's not, committing or anything. It's because you walked through the door, and after playing it cool for so long, after your own admission, you're like, yeah, I think God wants us to get married. And you're wondering why she's not going further past the, yeah, I like you too. Mike is incredibly self-unaware, even at this point, however many years later.
Does a great job describing you as very confident, playful, very carefree. Is that how you felt at that time as a person?
Well, I think in some way, it's like anything. There's like a dichotomy, at least I think, inside of every person. There's areas where they feel confident, and there's areas where they feel insecure. And so the things that you've done more often, you feel more confident about. Mm-hmm. So when it came to talking to people, being in front of people, and hanging out with people and having fun, that was completely my scene, and I was very confident in it. When it came to matters of internally knowing myself and being okay with how I felt about myself, completely not there.
Gotcha.
So, does that make sense?
It does. It definitely makes sense.
How long did you date before you got married?
How long did we date? This is crazy. If you don't consider what I said to her as an asking for her to marry me, then it was 2 months, and then we got engaged. And then it was 2 more months, and then I left for Africa for the summer. And I got back for a month, and then we got married in October. So we got engaged in April, and I was married in October.
Huh. What were you doing in Africa?
Fast. I did a missionary internship in Kenya, East Africa for the summer. Yeah, it was pretty fun.
So then how long after you were married did you start having kids?
5 years. So we were married for 5 years, and then we just had them all really quick.
I wonder if in the 5 years that they waited before having kids, if that lines up with him first going to Cedar Falls, doing that internship, being there for roughly 2 years before then going to Omaha. I wonder if that lines up. Just, it was a lot of moving, a lot of stress because he's first learning the job and she's learning a lot of her job. And again, a lot of what she's doing is basically volunteer work. Is he doing some volunteer work? Yeah, because he's not getting paid enough as a pastor, but at least he's getting some monetary compensation for it. So I do wonder that spread of when they decided to have their kids all basically at once, as he says. I wonder where that fits into him and in his ministry timeline.
Apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We did.
Yeah.
It was the same due date. Yeah, on the first 3, a year apart.
David has always spoken very admiringly of your parenting and some of the intentional things you did as a dad. Can you give just a couple examples of that?
Well, we thought we were ready, and we thought, hey, we're going to begin raising kids while being youth pastors, so we kind of begin with the end in mind. That was what we thought. We didn't realize that high school isn't the end, but we thought so at the time. And so we just really thought we care more about who they're becoming than what they're doing and their behavior. And so it started pretty early for us, just saying, we want to care about the person you are and the person you're becoming. And so all of our parenting kind of developed and flowed out of that. So it broke down into trying to parent out of what we thought was important or what we valued. It didn't begin this way. It kind of ended this way. We ended up with 11 family values that we felt like were important to us about raising kids and just living life. And so things like be with, like when you're with somebody, you're not on your phone. When you're watching TV, we only had one TV in the house.
Chad's
so
on his phone right now.
Everybody had to agree on a program. What's that?
Chad.
I do like this idea of finding and committing to family values that you want to pass on to your children. As he admits, it didn't start out that way. It very much turned into, well, these are our values and this is what we want to pass on down to you. I like that he includes like spending face-to-face time with members is key to him because technology can often get in the way of that. Even though they didn't start out with a plan, it sounds like they relatively quickly got their plan, their act together as parents. So that sounds good from just an outsider standpoint. You want you and your partner to be on the same page when you're raising kids, whether same-sex or regular heterosexual relationships.
On his phone right now.
So you're not being with.
Nope.
No.
So it was just kind of that nature. And then, just even when we were parenting, we tried not to do like if we're angry with our children because they, kids do make you mad.
They do.
Right.
We would never discipline out of anger.
Yeah.
And so, and then the principle we taught our kids are things like, you don't want to say what you're thinking when you're angry because you'll probably regret it. And you never want to touch somebody when you're angry because you'll probably touch them harder than you think you are. And that was mainly towards, between Drake and Josiah. I could say that, our two boys. You will always touch somebody a lot harder than you think you will.
Right.
Again, I don't disagree with these values. I do wonder if he's spanking them or if he included spanking in that. But generally, not knowing the answer to the spanking question, I don't disagree with what he and his wife, or at least what he's saying he and his wife are doing with disciplining their kids. Obviously, we don't know from the kids' perspective what it's like, but at least it sounds like he and his wife are on the same page. They're very much about disciplining out of love, not from anger as a parent, which is very crucial, and something that I think a lot of parents miss is when you discipline out of anger, the child only knows that you're angry. They don't understand why you're angry. You need to interact with them and explain what they're doing wrong and why it's wrong. Children will do their best to piss you off. I'm not denying that. But you can't let that affect you. You're the adult. If you need time to cool down as an adult, you take that time, by all means. You have that power and capability. The child doesn't. And again, everything from what I'm hearing, this sounds healthy.
Just things like that. We just
That's
tried to think it through.
Yeah,
That's
I've seen
cool.
some of the family values in some of Charla's writings on her blog.
So we're going to get to the tough part of this now, and that is you've been a pastor at First Assembly now for a while. You're the youth pastor starting in August 2001, and you start a relationship, if you will, with a member of your youth group. Can you kind of give us a little bit of idea of, I mean, this is obviously a horrendous mistake.
And a crime. Don't forget crime. So we're finally getting into 30 minutes and 12 seconds into the podcast, and we finally get to the topic of the podcast. Oh boy. I understand why the podcast host is coming into it the way he is, considering he is Mike's friend. But at the same time, it's a little disingenuous to just say it as a relationship. It was an inappropriate sexual relationship with a 17-year-old. It is a crime. And to just downplay it like he's doing, again, I understand why he's doing it, but it's very disingenuous for people who have a very cursory knowledge of the Mike Hintz affair.
Can you kind of talk us through briefly what happened?
Yeah, I think I even would say it was more than a mistake. It was a sin.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, at least Mike is saying it's a sin. He's not saying it's a crime. He's just saying it's a sin.
And so I think, I think knowing my baggage, especially, 10 years old, this journey started. At 33, 34 years old, I find myself in a place where I don't feel affirmed in my marriage. I feel like I have this young girl in my youth group that is very affirming. And, I mean, honestly, what takes place is we became sexually involved, and I was, it's trying to think how to say this in a quick way. It's so much.
Right. I know.
Yeah. So.
But maybe you shouldn't be trying to say it in a quick way, Mike. Again, you were the youth pastor in charge over her. Just because you feel that she was affirming and that you weren't getting what you needed to out of your marriage at that point, he was saying he was 33 or 34 years old at the time, that doesn't mean that you allow this to happen. I mean, unless she physically pinned you in a corner and forced you to have sex by being raped, because this is going on YouTube, so can't use the R word, that even you are the pastor, you are the adult male, and you are in charge. You don't, and you shouldn't be letting a teenager make these decisions for you. Feeling lonely in your marriage, I can understand that. But that doesn't mean that you just see every willing and seemingly affirming young lady in your nearby existence as people to use to feel like you're affirmed, you're taken care of. That means you and your wife probably need to take a sit down, and you probably need support from your parents, at least, to watch the kids while you two take time and figure out your marriage.
For me, I guess maybe the basis of your question is what was in it for me, is I didn't feel like I was good enough in anything that I did, even though everybody was telling me I was doing a great job. There was
coming from your past trauma. Not excusing your behavior, but it's understandable why you thought that, because that came from your past trauma. But if everybody, and I have no reason to believe that he's excluding his wife from this, if everyone is telling him he's doing a great job, what was really driving him to feel that way? To feel like he wasn't doing
information that I was finding inappropriately in a relationship, if you want to call it that, that led to what became
inappropriate sexual relationship.
Sexual exploitation of a client by a counselor is what the charge was. And so, me being 34, her being 17, it's, it's not a relationship how I would think you would define a relationship.
You've been through, and you were arrested. Is it difficult for you to share your story? This now that we're so many years later.
I don't know if it's. It's always difficult. Who ever wants to air their garbage out in front of the whole world? But
right.
It's been so publicized. It's been so out there that I don't think it's difficult for how it affects me. I think if anything, it's just wanting to be careful to not affect others
Right.
in a negative way, but also share the story in a way to say, man, if you're like me, there's a place of hope in that. So,
Yeah.
I don't disagree with if your life gets here, this is where you can find hope out of this. But at the same time, again, around the 30-minute, 12-second mark, we finally got into the whole story. Except we didn't get the whole story. We got him and his very biased, in my opinion, his very biased view of, yeah, I was 33, 34. I felt like I wasn't doing a great job. I felt like I wasn't getting what I needed. So, and there was this girl in our youth group that felt very affirming. So we began a relationship, which later turned sexual. It's very cursory. We're now at 32 minutes, 32 seconds into the podcast. Just to have heard him basically gloss over everything leading up to the relationship. And what I'm more confused by is there's no follow-up questions. There's no hard questions being asked here. Like, where is the question of why did you not believe people around you? Do you think that had something to do with your past? Why did you not believe your wife who was being affirming? Why did you not go to her? Why did you not suggest, hey, I'm not feeling this in my marriage, maybe let's take a moment? Why was your first instinct to go to someone who was affirming outside of your marriage and in a youth group that you led? Is it because you saw an opportunity to recreate the situation that happened to you in the past, but now you're the person in charge, so you can take advantage of her?
This was the year after you had been talking David through his recovery.
yeah, this is 2004.
2004. Okay.
So,
Couple years.
Yeah.
Just
past.
trying to place
yeah,
it.
like 3
Yeah.
years later.
You know, it's interesting how open. This is one of the similarities that you and I have is just the openness in sharing what happened to us. And as this was happening, and just a little backstory here.
Some of it is happening to us, as the host says, but he does a disservice by phrasing it that way. It is you engaging in actions that you decided at that point in time were the best courses of actions to follow. I'm not saying that future you doesn't feel regret or shame for that. And honestly, the fact that you do feel regret and shame for that is a mark of character and how far you come. And it also shows the redeeming power that Christ really does have. However, you can't minimize your past actions. You can't. When you engage in what the host did, which is pornography, and you really feel it's a sin, you really feel that it's bad, you don't minimize it as saying, well, as glossing it with a brush of stuff that happened to us. It is stuff that you chose to do at that point in time. I'm not saying that there weren't stumbling blocks in your life that didn't lead you down that path, but ultimately you did the things you did because you felt like they were your only course, your only hope at that point. Do you see how painting it with the brush of things that happened to us not only undercuts the severity of what you did, and especially what Mike did in this case, but also undercuts the harm that was done against others?
President Bush had gone through Iowa, which is always the first caucus state, and he pulled your family up on stage during some type of a rally. Is that correct?
Yeah, I got to actually meet George Bush, and we signed a family values tax law into effect with him.
And when you got arrested, and your mugshot is on television, and once the Democrats found out, and some of the more, let's say opportunistic people, they kind of have a field day with that, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean,
I wonder why. It's definitely not just a red versus blue issue, right? Republicans versus Democrats issue. No, this is also the fact that you signed, well, George Bush signed, but you were there when George W. Bush was signing into law the Family Values Pact. That has a huge public viewing when you're doing that with the President of the United States, and everybody's watching you when you do that. So naturally, when it comes to light that you went and had a inappropriate sexual relationship with a 17-year-old girl, that is a crime in state law, of course people are going to be saying, look, this is not congruent with the family values statement that you signed with the president, let alone with your values that you're supposed to have as a pastor. Not just a youth pastor of this girl and her peers, but also a pastor at large. I don't fault the people who brought this to light and made it into a news story, because standards are high for a reason. And when you break those standards, you need to suffer the consequences. I'm not saying that there can't be redemption for people like Mike or the host, but they also need to understand that it's not just them that were harmed or their immediate families. It's also the people outside who were affected by their decisions. They need to understand that. And somehow they danced right around it and were like, well, these people saw it and took advantage of it. I wonder why. Can you blame them? Especially when we see religious leaders, information coming out about religious leaders engaging in hypocrisy and also sex trafficking and just being horrible people to their underlings and their church followers. Do you not see it, or is it just so black and white to you that you don't understand why people on the other side would have a problem? And again, or I haven't said this before in this episode, but I think I said in a different one, people on the other side of the political aisle probably also consider themselves some kind of religious faith. I'm sure there's some atheists in there, but I'm sure others of them also consider themselves to be either Catholics, Episcopalians, Protestants of some kind of denomination, etc. Point is, there are people that are going to have different political beliefs from you that probably share the same spiritual values that you do. But why does their political bias in this case matter when Mike was clearly doing something inappropriate and wasn't initially going to confess what he was doing?
Had just gotten elected. This was October, that I signed it with him. He was elected in November. So it's November, mid to late November, maybe even December. I get arrested, and it was a heyday. I mean, I was on the local news in Des Moines. I was on the news in Omaha because I lived there. I was on MSNBC. It was a field day. I think at one time, you should never do this, but I Googled my name on the internet, and I had 126,000 hits in less than 30 seconds.
Oh.
Wow.
So and they weren't nice. They weren't like, oh, we love that guy. Yeah.
And
I wonder why. Again, we are 34 minutes and 22 seconds into this, and him admitting about his sin took maybe slightly longer than 2 minutes.
And there's still stuff out there that's not very nice. As I've done some prep stuff for this, and it's just and it's hard for me because I know you and love you and your family, and just it's just not fair at all. Some of the stuff is so pulled out Like, oh, we know this person did this thing. They're horrible. They're an awful person.
Yeah.
They deserve the worst of the worst of the worst. And I have to go back and go, man, how many times have I done that without knowing 1% of the story? And that's not minimum.
But again, you have to consider, podcast host and Mike, that the people who are saying these sorts of things are looking at the position that Mike held over that girl, and they're looking at what he signed with President Bush, and they're rightfully outraged. I'm not saying that as Christians we shouldn't be sympathetic to people who, or even outreach to people who have that kind of, or who have been suffering through those kinds of things. I'm not saying that, because Christians have very much a calling, a unique calling in the world. But what you have to think about is everybody else's reaction overblown, or is it justified concerning the circumstances? It is very much justified concerning the circumstances. And I don't think either of you really understand or appreciate that. And if I had to guess why, it's because you're used to everything being done behind closed doors. Nobody really knows, nobody really sees anything, and nobody really hears anything either. And you do that to as much protect the perpetrator as you do to protect the victim, if you even think about protecting the victim at all. And when stuff is not handled behind closed doors like you want it to be, you get very defensive, and you're like, well, I don't understand why this is happening, and this is just awful, and how could they be, why is this their reaction to me? It's very understandable given the circumstances.
How horrible, the sin that you did. Obviously, we're not trying to minimize that at all, but there is humans on the other side of these stories.
Well, I mean, for me, I would have rather, when this was coming out, and like before I finally sat down and talked to my wife and then talked to my pastor, I mean, I was so ready to run away from the whole situation that I had $4,000 in cash in a shoe in my closet, and my plan was to go to Machu Picchu, fake my death, and live in Peru.
Wow.
And just try to make a new life for myself.
That sounds so Mike Hintz to me. The adventure.
That's how diluted your thinking becomes when you're that scared.
Yep.
Which is understandable given what he did and what people's reactions to it were when they found out. Of course you're going to want to run away and hide. There's a reason why he denied the charges initially.
Just a question, do you happen to still keep $4,000 in a shoe in your home? I'm just curious.
No, I keep it all in socks now.
Excellent. Stocks or socks?
I like to say, no, it was definitely socks, not stocks.
Okay.
You can't trust the stock market, but you can trust your sock drawer.
I hope they're clean.
You can trust the sock market. Thank you. Anyways, so you and I are kind of similar in that we are very open about our stories. And I mean, people have told me before, a friend of mine at church has told me, you're nuts and you shouldn't do this. This is bad that you tell your story. Why do you think, what is it about guys like, you can help me understand myself. Why do guys like us do this? Why do we share our stories to such, what other people will call an insane level?
I don't really see this as sharing your story at an insane level. I see it as sharing your story with enough relevant details to get people interested in listening to what you're saying, but you're not really sharing your stories to an insane level. You're doing the bare bone minimum of admitting, this is what I did, and but I'm no longer doing this. I went through this process. I'm therefore clean of everything that I did before. You are very much using this as I used to do this, but I no longer do this, so therefore, don't be mad at me for what I did before. At least, that is how a reasonable person could take this. You're giving enough information for people to be like, wait, what did you do? And then saying, oh, it's fine, I went through this restoration process. Like, but that doesn't negate the action that you did before.
I only do it. I can't really take any ownership over why you do it. I can only say the reason I do it is I do it when I'm asked, and I figure, the truth is, if I can tell somebody my story and it keeps them from repeating it, then there's one less person hurt, and there's one more person set free. And to me, that makes all the difference in the world.
Cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have another idea about that, just from knowing David and from my own story. I feel like when you can share your story, it gives you some kind of ownership or control over it, so that it's almost empowering to be able to do that, to be able to help someone with it rather than let it define you.
Yeah, I think that's true, because if you're scared of sharing it, then it has a certain power over you.
Absolutely.
And I've always been such a big, I'm trying to get out there and saying, you can't have secrets. You gotta have. And I learned some of the stuff from you, Mike, as you're going through your counseling from this.
Yeah.
You're only as sick as your secrets, which is a real common phrase, but you start to really own that. And so for people listening, and you've got this deep, dark secret, and nobody knows. I mean, I'm just telling you, it's going to kill you. You just can't do that. It's really destructive.
Yeah.
Which I do agree with. Your secrets will find you out. So it's better to just own your secrets. And if people ask you, did you do this? Just acknowledge it. Say, yes, I did this. Understand and appreciate that it's the amount of things that you did, it may not ever be forgiven by people here on earth, and that is completely understandable and okay. People are people, and it's really hard. It can be really hard for people to forgive certain sins. That's where grace comes in and acknowledges that. But that doesn't mean that we just try to brush everything over and go, well, now it's okay, because it's not. It's not, and it usually never will be again. And there shouldn't be any kind of minimization for that, just because we should, as Christians, understand just how badly some sins affect certain people and be more willing and kind and compassionate towards them because of that.
The problem is...
No, in fact, there's a part of Charlotte's book that I was thinking about where she actually borrowed my journal to write it.
Yeah.
And there's this little excerpt where it talks about how sin works. And I always think it works like this. It works like this. It baits you in with a tiny compromise and a little diluted line of reasoning, only slightly veering from the truth. And then you try to fix your sin and the folly of your own folly in the shadows of your heart. And the reasons are always logical. It'll hurt my wife. It'll hurt my family. It'll hurt my friends. Nobody will understand. And then you think you can correct it before any real damage is done. And the more you try to fix it, the more it actually controls you. And then in my journal I wrote, it's like I was trying to wipe sap off my hands, and every place that I touched, attempting to clean, became dirty with the stickiness of sin. And then the shadow grew. And the shadow, which at one time seemed to be a place of refuge, became instead a dark pit of despair. And I drowned in it. And I think that's, if you can bring light into the shadowed area.
Which I 100% agree with that description. It was beautifully sad, beautifully written. Kudos to Charla for writing it. And that is why it being exposed and talking about it openly and honestly matters so much. And that is not being done here. Not to the extent that the podcast host and Mike think it's being done.
To somebody's heart so that they can actually experience freedom, then it's worth it.
Yeah, I agree.
The problem is that they need to feel safe in order for that to happen. Like, somebody can't open themselves up if they don't feel like they can do that safely and without fear of judgment and rejection. And
Yeah.
in David's story, we talked about how pornography is often a temptation for pastors because of their, well, partly because of their situation where they're often isolated and can't be honest or vulnerable with the people around them. Did you feel like that was your situation too? Or did you feel like you were facing this on your own? Like, was there anyone that you could talk to about your struggles at that time?
No, not at that time. I felt very isolated, very alone. And I felt like it was not a safe place. There was nowhere that was a safe place.
Yeah.
Which is understandable. And my sympathies are to Mike and to his wife and kids who are being still affected by his sins. Again, this is why accountability, actual accountability, and actually taking ownership of what you did and acknowledging how it hurt everybody and how it hurt people is so important.
I remember I was already through my restoration process with the Assemblies of God, which was a year long. And I remember getting a phone call, and it was you. And you told me what happened. And I know I was one of many phone calls that night because you and I only spoke for a couple minutes. Of course, I had no idea what to say other than I love you, and I'm here for you, and you tell me what you need, and I'm here. Do you remember how many phone calls you made that night?
And who was there to do the phone call for the young lady? Who was there to help the young lady as she struggled and as she was tormented? Was there anybody making calls to her, reaching out to her? Or was it because she was the victim of a pastor, she was seen as untouchable and horrible, and it's all her fault?
Actually, I made more visitations than phone calls.
Okay.
So I actually went around and talked to my neighbors because it was all coming out.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want them to find out by watching the news.
That takes balls, and I'm glad he did that I'm glad he told that to the neighbors.
For different things like that. So it was, and you were really, really early on. You were probably a little bit before my neighbors, but I couldn't make more than 2 phone calls a night in that time frame because it was hard.
If you could go back in time and deliver a message to yourself before any of this stuff happened, what age or when would you have picked if you could have delivered a targeted message to yourself before any of this, the sin happened and the delusion and the refuge and the darkness? When do you think you might have been able to deliver that, and what might you have said?
Good question. I like it.
Oh my goodness. I can't tell you how many times I've thought about this.
Oh, I know, because I've done the same thing in my life.
I think I would go back to myself as a 4th grader, and I would probably clarify the message that I received then. So, and to do that...
Oh, no. No. That's sending the wrong message to anyone who survived any kind of sexual abuse. It's never about clarifying what the perpetrator said to you. It's about exposing the perpetrator.
Jump way ahead, and hopefully this is not too bad. The day after I told Charlotte everything, and everything fell apart, and she took the kids and went to her dad's house, her mom and dad showed up at my...
I don't blame her for her picking up the kids and going over to her parents' house. I wonder what her parents did to force her back with you.
House.
Oh, boy.
And, and I was ready. I was kind of bracing myself. They knocked on the door, and I saw it was them, and I didn't want to answer the door, but I think they knew I was home.
Yeah.
And so I went to the door, and I was just expecting to get blasted, and David, her dad, walked in, and his wife, Chris, and he said, "Before anything, we just want to tell you something." And in my mind, I thought, "Okay, here it comes.
Right.
I mean, I'm ready. You can. I probably agree with you. You can say everything you want to say because it won't be anything that I haven't said to myself. And he said, I just want you to know that we love you, that we're still proud of you, and that this is just a speed bump.
Wow.
And I remember thinking, what in the world? A, why do you love me? B, how could you be proud of me? And C, why in the world do you think this is a speed bump? Because I feel like I drove the car off the cliff and it crashed on the bottom of the cliff wall and burst into flames like you see on TV.
Honestly, that is a very understandable reaction. I'm wondering what her parents told her when she came over with the kids. Did they tell her the same thing, or was it all reserved for the perpetrator, Mike in this case? Now, to be clear, if you have a friend who does something like this, and you're struggling to support them, not minimize the sin or the damage that they did, but you're struggling to support them so that they can come back from this and so they can continue living their lives, because otherwise they're pretty decent people. I understand exactly why Charlotte's parents came over and said the things that they said. But again, you have to make sure that in this case, their own daughter who was damaged by his sin is taken care of first. Why? She's probably the primary caregiver of their 4 kids. She's probably also financially, she's also going to take the financial burden when she leaves. So why don't you talk about, and why aren't you talking about what her parents did with her? I understand this is about Mike Hintz and his story, but he's not even concerned about what happened to his wife and her taking the kids, and he's not concerned about her at all. It's all still him. It's all about Mike.
Yeah.
And if I could do anything, I would go back to my 4th grade self and basically tell myself the same thing, that I still love you,
Yeah.
I'm proud of you, and this isn't as big as you feel like it is, and we can walk through this.
Wow.
And just make it a safe place. I think that would be the most important message that I was missing.
No, the most important message you were missing, Mike, is you are loved, you are valued, and what the perpetrator and the authority figure are doing are wrong, and they need to be reported. And you can do what it takes to break this cycle of abuse. I don't disagree with him telling himself this, because I understand, well, you're the victim and you need to make sure that the victim's taken care of. I completely get that. It's more so for me. I'm more frustrated by him not wanting the perpetrators, the alleged perpetrators in his account of his 4th grade sexual abuse, the perpetrator and the authority figure who just enabled the abuse. I don't understand why he doesn't see it as wrong, why he doesn't want it redone, why he doesn't want to go forward and prosecute it, because then he could have gotten the help that he needed back then, and maybe this wouldn't have happened. I'm struggling very much with it, like I said, because he is seeming to not want to take actual accountability or be actually brutally honest about his sins here. And he also is like, well, I just want to make sure that my 4th grade self understands that someone loves me. It's like, yes, someone loves you. And that's why you need to report it, so that no one else has to go through the same thing that you're going through. It's so frustrating for me.
Do you still, I mean, that's very, and I've referenced Christ's life or the ultimate journey on this show before. That's a very, very Christ life. Do you still have to go back to that 4th grade boy and
I think you mean Christ-like.
still do that today?
But no, this is not Christ-like. This is very much, I'm not going to actually take accountability for what I did, And I don't want the people who hurt me to take accountability for what they did.
The thing, I don't. I think I did that. The harder part was going back to the 34-year-old man and loving him and not hating him.
Right, because if there's one thing that this country despises, and rightfully so, it's someone who hurts children. And I totally get that. How, out of what place do you think they were able to do something like that? Because there's a lot of people listening who are like, they shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. But I'm here to say I applaud what they did, and I think it was fantastic. And that's because I know who you are, and I knew the state of your heart at the time.
Sure.
What do you think that was born out of? How in the
You can make that claim, but this is at least one listener who will press X to doubt your claim.
world were they able to?
By the way, thank you for acknowledging why other people find this so horrifying in the briefest sentence you possibly could.
Do that.
Oh, my in-laws?
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know. I think they were wiser and older than I was, and they saw something in me that was maybe like wrong, and I don't even know if they saw that it was wrong. They just loved me, and
Wow.
I guess for me it was just, I think the only way they could do that is because they had received grace in their life. That'd be the only way that you could give grace.
Right. Because, grace is really grace when it's hard to give, and it's when it's most needed. Grace is a word we throw around a lot, but boy, when it's really difficult and you don't deserve it, the least is when grace is needed the most.
Yeah. And if your message is...
Again, I don't necessarily disagree with this idea, but think about the potential consequences and about how their reactions are so far. It's very much, yeah, this is horrible and we should move past it. Or, this is horrible and what are the steps needed to get you back on the road you need to be? What is wrong about dwelling on the fact of, I did something wrong and I need to atone for it, and I understand I need to atone for it, and it'll take a while for me to get back to where I was at, and that's okay because I understood that I did something wrong, and while I have grace from people, I will do what I can to atone for what I did, whether it's through the criminal justice system or by other means. Where is that?
If anybody finds out about this, they're going to hate me, and they'll never want... that was my message from 4th grade on. So anything counter to that has, if you're braced for impact and then you get that instead, it's like you fall on your face. There's nothing you can do.
So could you tell us a little bit about how Charla reacted and how it kind of came out? And because I think at first you had denied it, and then I'm not saying that's okay, but I get it. Could you kind of walk us through a little bit about the discovery and how Charla reacted when you told her it was true?
Sure. It started coming out, and I did deny it at first, and then I was doing that contemplation: should I run away to Machu Picchu, fake my death, and try to live life as if I'm Peruvian? And
yes, because you look Peruvian.
I do, and I don't even speak Spanish, so that would have been a bummer. So there was a point in time where I just gave up, and I sat down with her. It was a night after we put the kids to bed. She was doing laundry. I can still picture it, and I just sat down with her, and I said, I need to talk to you about something, and said, everything that you're hearing and everything that I've been denying is actually true. And I just went through and I told her, and she reacted like anybody in that situation. She screamed into the laundry because she didn't want this to be her life, and it was hard. It was really hard. And
oh my God, I feel so bad for Charla. I mean, at least he had the balls to admit finally to her face that he was doing it and that the allegations were actually true, even though he was denying them. My heart just goes out to Charla. That I totally understand her reaction.
She didn't want to talk to me. She was extremely mad at me. She wanted me to die. She actually spent that whole night praying that I would die. And then she left the next day with kids. And I mean, I look back at that now and I think, like, that she would even be that transparent with me in the moment is amazing, because I just can't imagine how much that hurt her.
Yeah.
And you still can't imagine how much you hurt her. That is what boggles my mind, Mike. How can you still admit after years of this, like, you don't... I don't know if it's because of your upbringing, your past trauma, or what, but can you really not imagine how much you hurt her? Like, why would you say that? Surely now, after over 10 years later after that incident, why can't you even try to empathize with her even a tiny bit and say, yeah, like, I don't understand the depth of trauma she was feeling, but I think if the tables were reversed, I would be able, the pain that I feel just thinking about it would probably be similar. Still pale in comparison to hers because she actually experienced it, but it would be similar to hers.
So how on earth did your marriage survive? What steps did you take?
If you can't tell, Carol's got a few tears right now.
Oh, yeah. I wish that there was, like, it was easy and you'd say, like, because we as Americans, we just want 3 steps to wholeness.
Well, I was thinking more like 7 steps to the restoration, but 3 would be good.
Yeah, 3's better.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, 3 would be good. I'm just saying what Americans want. They want
I know.
Right.
1 step. I think first and foremost was I had like me getting honest and sitting down with her and doing a full disclosure. This is everything. Any question you want to ask, lay it all on the table. So there was no question. And not even knowing what was ahead for me because it was a legal issue. They also did sexual history polygraphs. So if I had lied to her on the initial one, she would have found out later. Didn't know that. But just being transparent, and then it's just.
I wonder if that would have affected your honesty in the moment, but you were honest after initial periods of lying, so that at least is something.
It's a long process of rebuilding trust and durability to your relationship, and so then it's just every day. Like, I think for me, because I can't talk on her book will tell you her side of the story.
Yeah, I've read her book.
And we're gonna have her.
We're waiting for yours.
And we're gonna have her on the podcast too. So.
Well, I hope so.
Now, I don't know if they actually did have her on the podcast at a future point, but I would like to do a reaction to her podcast if that ever comes out.
I have a book by the end of the year. That's my goal.
Excellent.
But it's not really necessarily the same as hers. But I think for me, it
Now, it's not going to be the exact same as hers, but I think that's, again, something he's missing here. Just because your experience isn't the exact same as another person's, it doesn't mean that your inability to empathize with what they might have gone through goes unnoticed, if that makes any sense. You saying, well, this is what I gone through and this is what I observed from another person, doesn't negate you saying, look, I could empathize with them up to a certain point, or I am trying to understand how they feel. I can't understand how they feel, but I'm super sorry and I will do whatever I can to make it up. There's not really anything from Mike, and maybe it's because it's over 10 years later, but there's not really anything from Mike, given from Mike in this podcast, that leads me to believe that he said any of those things to her?
Came from when everything was stripped away and I literally had nothing. There was this moment where all I had was my relationship with Jesus. And it was in that moment that I realized this is really all that I've had all along. Like, everything else that I thought I had, I didn't really have. And, he's the only true affirming voice in my life. And I had to find my true affirmation for who I was in him, because the road ahead of me wasn't easy. And I know that you remember this, David, because you were there for some of these comments. It was months that Char was mad at me.
Yeah.
And it was months that there were undercutting, sarcastic comments about how I'd ruined her life. And
to be fair, you did, and that's completely understandable from her part. And why is she even back with you at this point? Or is she still at her parents' and you're just visiting her?
if I was looking in any way, shape, and form for any affirmation of how I was doing in my wife, I would have never found it. And if I was looking for it in her, I could never give her what she needed, which was a guy who was on his path to wholeness because he had gotten himself right in his relationship with God and his relationship with the people around him. So it was just, for me, it was just doing.
So is that your roundabout way, Mike, of admitting that you were absolutely failing her and you kind of guessed it before you had a sexually inappropriate relationship with a 17-year-old? Just curious. Side note, I do think that this is a little bit more honest about his interactions with Charla after he admitted it to her. And I don't want to discount his efforts to make himself a better person and to win her back, but I also don't want to discount her hurt and pain. It's very hard, and it's something that I really hope that Charla was not pressured into. I hope she wasn't pressured to take Mike back before she was ready, because that would be an enormous amount of pain to her and to the relationship, especially when they're just trying to regain trust and try to build it back from the ground up.
That over and over again, letting her know I loved her. But then for her, it was a decision. Am I going to choose him again? And she had the right to not. She had the right to divorce me and walk away. And for a while, that's exactly what she said she was going to do. And I had to accept it, that I was going to be okay without that. And it brought me to really some hard realities in life. You know, the truth is, for all eternity, I'm not going to be married to Charlotte. I'm going to be single. And, honestly, that's how I was born. And so in the way that I was created, I wasn't eternally meant to be married. I was meant to be God's. And so in that, he should be enough for me. But working through that, in the midst of this, that was a 2-year, 3-year process. And then for her, it was making a choice depending on what she wanted to do and what she felt like God was leading her to do. Not what I was trying to talk her into, not what anybody, because everybody will offer their opinion in the moment.
If it's wanted or not.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
and here I am offering my opinion. So, at least from what it sounds like she made the decision on her own, which, to her credit, I completely understand why she would choose to go back with him. It doesn't mean I would agree with it, but I would understand why. But as long as it was her own decision, that's all I care about.
how long did you feel as if you were trying to earn her love back or heal that love? And can you remember when you knew she had forgiven you?
There's two different parts. There was a time about 4 months into it where she said, okay, I'm willing to go do a marriage intensive with you. which was the first admission on her part that she even wanted to work on our marriage, which I took as a huge sign.
Yeah.
Which is amazing, and I'm glad she said that. Again, it's important that it comes from her, and it's not influenced by anybody, least of all Mike.
But it wasn't like a promise because I'm going to stay with you and we're going to work through this thing. It was like, I'm going to see if there's any hope for our marriage. We'll go to this intensive, and if there's any hope, then maybe I'll make a decision after that. And so we kind of went through the marriage intensive.
Which is fair, because given how much trust has been broken at that point, I wouldn't blame anyone, regardless who was the cheating partner, to just divorce their cheating partner. At the same time, I also understand wanting to keep the marriage together, but you also have to be realistic. So at least compared to most people I've heard about and most speculations about women who have to go back to their cheating husbands or men who go back to their cheating wives, it's very much, this sounds much more enlightened of an approach that she had. And I really do hope and pray that that was something that she chose, and that was between her and God.
We did. It was a week-long intensive. And then after that, there was a time frame where she, probably within a couple months after that. So
I do also hope that for this marriage intensive thing, that they kept the couples apart in separate rooms just to make sure that, at least for part of the camp, and the reason for that is if there's a reason for infidelity, it's very easy for the cheating partner to wear down their spouse into accepting them back. So that's the other thing that you have to be careful of.
I would say February or March, she said, I was praying about it, and I know that I can never trust you again. And I won't ever trust you again. And so this, to me, was the determination of she was going to leave me.
Right.
But she said, I was praying about it, and I asked, Lord, what did you want me to do in this? And he said, I didn't ever ask you to trust Mike in that way. I just asked you to trust me.
Wow.
And so the question was, can you trust me in your relationship with Mike more than you trust Mike?
Yeah.
And when she walked through that, she realized that was exactly what God wanted her to do.
I do find this anecdote interesting because it is very much a Christian thing of well, you're not told to trust your partner that way. It's just God who should have that amount of trust. So then when the question of cheating does come up, it's, well, oftentimes the answer from just people is you shouldn't be trusting your partner like that anyway. It should just be in God. So you should just trust God and stay married, which is how another tactic to keep people in awful and abusive relationships. Now, if this was something that Charla really deeply felt, and this is what she felt God was telling her, you go, Charla, you do your thing. I'm not going to say I understand it. I understand it from the Christian perspective of trusting God, but at the same time, there was a major promise that was broken, so you can't disregard that. But if she feels that God was telling her to stay with Mike, who am I to say that she shouldn't or that she didn't hear something from God like that? Now, I would never accept it if they were peddling it as marriage advice, but this is something that appears from all outward appearances, appears to be working for both of them.
And she said, but I need you to know, I don't feel like I love you. I don't even know I'll ever say that I love you, but I am choosing this because I feel like this is what pleases the Lord.
So you grow up.
Which is completely fair, again, from her. she's telling him, look, I'm with you because, and this is my version, she's saying, look, let's be real, I'm here because God wants me to. I don't like it. I'm not going to trust you. And I really probably will never trust you ever again. And I probably won't like you either. But I'm staying here because I feel like God wants me to be here. Now, is that, you also have to ask yourself, is that fair to Mike as well as Charla? Is that attitude fair? The Christian perspective would say it's fair to both of them because, yeah, she's being honest, but she's doing what God wants her to do. Whereas you would look at it from a secular perspective, and it would be, it's not fair to either of them because Mike cheated, and not to discount his cheating, but there was a reason he cheated, and not to discount Charla's pain and anger because that's a completely valid response when your partner is cheating on you. So maybe it's just better that they divorce and Mike finds somebody else. I find reasonable points in both perspectives, which is why an episode like this really makes me struggle. It's the, well, we did this and this is why it's all better. It's like, no. You did, first of all, you didn't even actually be brutally honest about your sin. You didn't actually take ownership of what you did to the 17-year-old. And you barely took ownership of the fact that your cheating caused your wife to be very angry at you. I don't expect him to know what his wife was up to during this entire time, but I do find it interesting that it's very much like a shortened version of events of what happened. Granted, it is 10 years later, and they probably love each other again, and they have some semblance of their old marriage back, but at the same time, it just seems off to me.
And you feel like, this horrible thing has happened to you. It becomes your normal, and the normal then becomes to hide, because if someone knew who I really was, they'd reject me, and I can't let them see how damaged I am. Then you get into the pastorship, which is just like this perfect, unholy, unhealthy fit for that. And then you were able to flip it all around and become insanely vulnerable.
Yeah.
How do you think you achieved that?
Well, I would say I achieved it because it's funny because I would never use the word achieved because I didn't achieve it. 2 years before this whole thing happened, I prayed a prayer because I knew that something wasn't right internally, like with the way I was living. And I said, God, I feel like there's pride in me. I feel like there's things in me that would keep me from a relationship with you. And I don't know how to get over it. I want you to do whatever it takes. And I really feel like this was him. So when you ask, how did I achieve this or how did I get over it? I think like the Lord exposed this in me by my choices. So I don't think he caused any of this to happen, but he used my choices.
Right.
And he brought them into light and exposed me so that he could have me.
It's as if he let you act upon your weaknesses so that you would learn how much you needed him.
But the thing is I know people.
I do like her take on it because that is very much something that we see, especially from Jesus, where it's when you're at your weakest point, when you're at your weakest self, you realize just how much you need him, and he is there, and he's more than willing and ready to help you. That is what is so compelling, to me at least, about Christianity and Jesus, because he is there and he wants to be there and to help you. And I am not saying this to discount what Mike did. I'm glad that Mike did the crime that he did, finally took ownership of it, and 10 years later is seeing something better come out of it. I want there to be more understanding and more accountability coming from him for what he did and what he did to the 17-year-old, as well as finding out if there was any counseling that happened with her so that she would understand that it wasn't her fault and that she would not be going through the same victim blaming that Mike put her through and continues to put his fourth grade self through.
Who have gone through things like this besides you and I, and what your choice was is not the normal choice. I think that's...
Which is sad, isn't it? When people who do sin, especially in religious communities, in religious positions of power, they sin and they choose to cover it up and keep it quiet. They choose to not acknowledge it. That is where I do have to give the podcast host and Mike Hintz some credit. They at least are willing to address it, not in an attitude that I feel is actually addressing and taking on the full weight of the guilt of their actions, but they're at least addressing it and acknowledging it and saying, hey, we had to go through a process to effectively redeem ourselves, at least in the eyes of certain people. For the podcast host, it was redeem himself with Mike Hintz. With Mike, it was redeeming himself in the eyes of Charla, and eventually enough to become a pastor again.
My point there, and achieved is the wrong word, but this isn't the normal way this story plays out.
Well, neither was Charla's.
No, not at all. But it started with Mike going,
Thank you. Someone's bringing up that point about Charla, even if it's just a brief point.
Going to now flip on its head everything I've learned and trusted and lived to be true. I'm now going to go completely, I'm going to start swimming upstream from that.
Yeah.
Which is a deliberate choice that you made.
Yeah, I think somewhat it's a choice and somewhat it was I think things changed in me. The minute that Charlotte's dad told me that he loved me and that he was proud of me and that this was just a speed bump, caused a new thought to enter into my head that I honestly think the Lord used to rewire something in me that said, I believed a lie for a really long time, that if people knew this about me, they would hate and reject me, and I would be discarded.
So it was this instance of extreme grace that started you down that path to be able to do that and start swimming upstream.
Yeah, and then it was just, and I really feel like there were times where even the way I thought was beginning to be rewired in the midst of this, where now I was living with no secrets, and I found greater freedom. And, you know, even now when I tell my story, I don't want to hold it back because I feel like this isn't the story I would have chosen if I could go back to being a starry-eyed 16-year-old. What do you want to do with your life?
Right.
But this is the journey that God has brought me through, and I'm so proud of who He is in that.
Wow.
That, like, to not tell His story in my life would be almost as sinful.
Yeah. So we're got to start wrapping up here. We're running out of time. So, and I know this is
So this is where the podcast begins to wrap up. I want to say thank you for sitting with me for so long as I went through, listened, and offered my insight on this podcast. Again, I feel very strongly that this is not how an apology podcast should be done, especially not by someone who was a church youth group leader and still currently is involved as a church leader nowadays. I feel that this is just a quick overview, and the actual sin that was committed was briefly brushed aside after being brought out for practically a split second in the eyes of the podcast. And then was, well, we're just going to talk about the aftermath. We're not going to dwell anymore on the why did this happen. It's been 10 years. I would say that if it's been 10 years and Charla and Mike are still together, they could definitely, especially Mike, could do some introspection on why did he go for an inappropriate sexual relationship with a 17-year-old girl in the youth group he was leading. There needs to be more introspection and also just more compassion for her. As we saw, Mike not only victim blamed himself multiple times, but he also subtly victim blamed the 17-year-old girl. It's not her fault for seeming affirming to him. It's not her fault for being there and seeming available to him. It is his fault for not seeing the temptation and immediately thinking, oh, well, this is a great idea. This is not what a podcast apology should look like. I am disappointed, but I am not surprised given what we learned over the course of this podcast episode with the podcast hosts.
Question on people's minds that are listening right now. And that question is how do you make sure that you don't make, you're a pastor again, which you and I talked many times through the years, the 2000s, into the, even in 2010, 2011, and totally understood. You were like, I will never be a pastor again. And you and I, we used to laugh about people who did that, and they're insane, and there's no way. And I'm super proud. I'm super proud of you, my friend. So proud of you. So excited for you and your family that you are back in ministry. Because I always had this feeling like there's no way that can be done in your life because you have so much talent, God-given talent. But the big question is, how do you make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again?
Yeah. Well, I think.
And it's very much a needed question. We don't hear it often enough within churches.
First of all, I would agree with you. I never thought I would become a pastor again. And I didn't want to. I got the phone call and sat down with a friend of mine who brought the idea, who happens to be on staff here. And I said to him, Mike, you know my whole story. What are you thinking? This is a bad idea.
Yeah.
And he's like, we just feel like this might be God. I was like, so I prayed about it, and I felt like, honestly, I think it is God. I think this is what he wants to do. And so I think
But that doesn't take into account the process of becoming a pastor again, the process of being selected, the process of being asked. There's a whole bunch of other questions that aren't being asked about this. Like, why? Sure, you feel that God is leading you to it. Okay, well, what about the church? Then the church says, well, we feel like God is leading us to call him to be a pastor. But why? Why do you feel that way? What reasons is God giving you? And just because, well, God told me so, that isn't a great reason. That's how Catholic priests get around with and get away with moving priests around from parish to parish that sexually abuse children. And I deeply believe that there is a pit of hellfire that is awaiting them. Not just them, but other pastors and teachers who abuse children in that way, as well as other adults, but primarily those in positions of power over children. It is something that shouldn't be just swept under the rug because you feel like God told you so. You should be able to say to people, look, these are the reasons we're bringing Mike back. These are the reasons that we feel that Mike has changed, and this is what we're doing to make sure that it doesn't happen again. For example, making sure that he doesn't lead another youth group. It's not rocket science.
He is not living in fear. If I live scared of making that mistake again, then that fear will have a power over me.
Right.
But if I live the exact same way I lived the last 10 years, where like, when my wife is gone, like she is right now, and if I have any desire to look at anything inappropriate, or I'm texting her, hey, tomorrow morning when you wake up, ask me what I watched last night. And so that it's just habit now. It's just in me. I don't live in a way that I keep those things hidden. I live in a way that they're open.
I don't disagree with his method of texting his wife just to make sure that they keep the lines of communication open, and so she verifies that he's still being open and honest with her. It's the idea of, well, I'm not living in a position of fear, and I can't be living in a position of fear because that is how I will get tempted again. It's how do you explain that and explain the steps to people who, on the outside looking in, even within the church, because most of the church is still on the outside looking in for most board decisions, they're going to be looking at and saying, we don't understand. Can you assuage our fears? And it's so easy for that to become blaming other people where, well, you're living in fear. You need to learn to trust God. They have concerns. This is not an irrational fear that they have that a random pastor is going to come in and start sexually abusing the youth group people. This is their reasonable belief that Mike Hintz is just going to come in, be a youth group pastor again, and sexually abuse people again, and because he did it before. It's not unreasonable, and I don't like the insinuation, however soft it is, that it is an unreasonable take.
So it's not a prevention plan, but it's just a living plan. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Sure does.
Carol and I have been working on doing that with each other, giving my story. And it's just, it becomes a way you live your life without apology. It's just like, no, this is just how we have to do life, and it's okay.
Yeah.
So how are you and your family doing now?
We're doing great. Our kids are 21, 20, 19, and about to be 17. And we're doing great. Shar and I are doing great. We just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary.
Aww.
It's like we are really doing what God has asked us to do, and we're enjoying it.
Here's my last question for you.
Sure.
Can you tell me the difference between Pastor Mike Hintz in 2002 and Pastor Mike Hintz of today?
I feel like it feels like in some ways it's night and day. I think Pastor Mike Hintz of 2002 was living in fear all the time of if somebody really knew who I really was, they wouldn't love it and or accept me. And Pastor Mike Hintz now is like, I don't care if anybody loves me as long as I'm good in my relationship with God, everything else is fine because he defines who I am. And I think that's probably, like, I do care. I'm not insensitive and cold to people. But I think Pastor Mike Hintz of 2002 was more concerned about people affirming him and loving him because it made him feel better about who he is. And now,
this is where I wish Carol would have gotten in another good question to him about how can churches with pastors who are struggling help their pastors in such a way so that they don't get into the same temptations that Mike Hintz did. Because Ministry Watch actually did a 75 red flags to watch for, and I will also link that in the description below. But in conjunction with that, it's pastors are often overworked, underpaid, but also underserved just even within their own churches and denominations. So I feel that a great follow-up question here would be, how should churches help their pastors how should churches help support their pastors? I really feel like that is an underrated topic, especially when topics of sexual abuse and misconduct by pastors come out like this.
it's just my relationship with God. It's literally the only thing holding me together.
Yeah.
at the same time, knowing how healing that was for you to hear that message from your father-in-law, knowing what that would have meant to me at 15 or 14
Yeah.
or 13, and knowing what it would have meant to David,
Yeah.
even though we don't need to be looking for that from other people, I think that's something we can look to provide to other people.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Exactly. And I even think as we raise our own kids to be thinking about the power of the message. When you catch somebody doing something wrong, they already feel ashamed because you caught them. And if we could...
Not always. And oftentimes they will deny, just like you did, Mike, what they did.
somehow de-escalate our surprise and escalate our love, our reaffirming you haven't lost anything
Yeah.
in your relationship with me, and this is just a speed bump, then it gives them context to actually overcome their situation rather than feel like, I guess I've blown too big.
Yeah.
Right. And I can't be fixed. I can't be repaired. I've blown it, and there's no way back for me.
Yeah.
That's the fear. And we know that perfect love casts out fear. And I'm just, again, struck by, and I know your in-laws a little bit, just what an incredible moment, what an incredible gift from God that was to
Yeah.
you.
It's
Yeah,
really cool.
it really was.
That's
They
awesome.
are. They're
Also, I didn't mention this before, it's also striking that it's his in-laws that are reaching out to him like this. Not his own parents, but his in-laws, his wife's parents. Think about that and how they reacted to him. And then think about how they might have reacted to their daughter. And also think about, why did Mike's own parents not reach out to him?
totally good.
All right. We're going to wrap it up. Mike, thank you so very much for being willing to come on the show and
bet.
just share all this, because my heart, I think, is the same as yours in many ways, is we have to share these stories so that people can learn how to get free. So Mike, here's what I want you to do, and then I'm going to close this up. There's people listening right now that are in a dark spot. They're in a dark time. They've done something that they're ashamed of, and they don't feel like they can tell anyone. You and I know exactly how that feels. Could you speak to them for a minute?
Yeah. I would say this. If you're at all like me, you desperately want to be free. And the good news, and also the hard news, is the path to freedom is usually the one that you're most scared of.
Mm-hmm.
But if you trust in the midst of this, the way God has set things up, and I think in James chapter 5, verse 16, it says, if you confess your sins to one another, you will be healed. He's faithful and just to forgive you, and you'll be healed. That whole mindset of letting out the secrets and not keeping them in will actually allow healing to take place in your life. And so often we struggle alone with our secrets because we think nobody can understand us. You don't know how bad it is. You don't know what I've done wrong. And I would rather try to find any other way. And the truth is, you can't do this alone. Like, that act of letting it out allows light to shine in an area that is dark right now. And secrets, they always kill.
My friend, I love you.
I like that point by Mike. And I also want to add on to that. Don't hesitate in owning your mistake. People's reactions are going to be their reactions. Accept it. Accept that if you were reacting to your own mistakes, you'd probably have a similar reaction. Acknowledge it. Move on. Do your best to make atonement for what you've done, and do your best to become a better person. Obviously, if you are a Christian, you will do your best to become a better person with Christ. At least that is my hope and goal and prayer. if you are not a Christian, I hope that you are doing your best to become a better person. Don't forget to acknowledge your mistakes and the pain that they caused. Don't write it off, but also don't hesitate to acknowledge that you are still working to become a better person. None of that is a bad thing. And also, have someone who you can trust to be your partner in keeping yourself accountable. That is what you need. Again, overall, not a bad podcast in terms of just general content. I like the format. The hosts seem pretty awesome, and Mike seems very affable. But again, looking at the content, it seems very, very light and easy considering what Mike did. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of accountability taken by Mike for the harm that he caused the 17-year-old, as much as he talked about how it ruined his life and Charla's life. I question the efficacy of a podcast like this when the person takes 2 minutes to briefly do a brief rundown of their sin, and there's no follow-up questions of what's, looking back on it now, was there something? Because there should have been at least 5 minutes spent on it, just with follow-up questions to, well, why did you feel that way? What in your life was making you feel that way? Were there situations going on with you, the wife, or the kids, or maybe your parents, maybe her parents, maybe the congregation, and fitting into back into Des Moines was being stressful? There was none of that being asked, and it was all him talking about how he basically, or insinuating, he insinuated that he was led into this relationship with a 17-year-old, and it was her doing. And I have a really hard time with that when he's the pastor, her youth group pastor, and he should have been in charge, and he chose to instead have that inappropriate sexual relationship with her. In my less than humble opinion, there were not enough hard questions asked about his actual sin. So I would say it's not accurate. It's not accurate to the notes. And as fun as it was to listen to Mike monologuing about his life in other ways, it doesn't do what it needs to do as an actual accountability episode. If you like this episode, please consider liking the video, subscribing to my YouTube channel, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching and listening. Honestly, I wouldn't be able to do this without any of you guys. As few as you are right now, I appreciate each and every one of you. If there's stuff or content that you want me to cover, please consider messaging me at my YouTube channel or just commenting on the video down below. Thank you.